the death knell for the Comanche, beneath the fiery red sky of the Texas Panhandle, where the wind carries the scent of dust and gunpowder. The final chapter of a fading era is about to be written. The Battle of Pocket Canyon in 1877, the climax of the Buffalo War, was more than just another skirmish. It was the tragic end of the Comanche's once mighty fighting power. This time, there was no place for immortal legends, only blood staining the arid grasslands, the sound of hooves trampling the ashes of a bygone age. The last Comanche warriors, led by battle-hardened chiefs, charged into a fight with no escape, knowing that the coming dawn would no longer belong to them. And when the smoke cleared, the vast staked plains would forever fall silent, never again echoing with the presence of the riders who once made the frontier tremble. The Battle of Pocket Canyon did not just mark the end of a war. It closed a glorious chapter in the history of the last nomadic warriors of America, the destroyers of the buffalo herds. In the winter of 1876, icy winds cut through the Texas Panhandle, carrying an emptiness never felt before. The once massive buffalo herds that had blanketed the plains were now just a memory. Millions had been slaughtered by white hunters for their hides, a deliberate campaign of destruction aimed at breaking the Comanche, the nomadic warriors who depended on these animals for survival. Sharps' rifles thundered across the grasslands as entire herds collapsed, their blood staining the thick snow red, leaving behind a scene of death stretching all the way to the horizon. Quanah Parker, the last survivor. Quanah Parker was born between two worlds, the proud Comanche blood of his father, Quanah, and the legacy of his white mother, Cynthia Ann Parker, who had been kidnapped but became one with the tribe. Raised among nomadic warriors, Quanah inherited not only the skills of horseback riding and combat, but also an unbreakable spirit and a fierce will to survive. As the Comanche stood on the brink of extinction, he did not choose to die. As a legend, he chose to live and reshape the fate of his people. Rising as their supreme leader, Quanah was both the last warrior of a bygone era and the pioneer of a new chapter in Comanche history. Black Horse leaves the reservation. In December 1876, Black Horse and about 170 Comanche warriors left the Kiowa Comanche Reservation, heading toward the Texas Panhandle in search of food and to strike back against the white hunters who had slaughtered the buffalo. Their raids were swift and brutal, spreading fear among the buffalo hunters. Many retreated to Rath's Store, a trading post near the Canadian River, to organize their defenses. However, smaller hunting parties continued to venture out in search of buffalo, making them easy targets for Black Horse and his men. At dawn, seasoned hunter Marshall Sewell stepped out of Rath's Store, rifle slung over his shoulder, eyes scanning the horizon for any remaining buffalo. But he had no idea that, hidden among the low brush, sharp eyes were watching his every move. A bowstring tightened in the silence. An arrow sliced through the air and buried itself deep in Sewell's chest. He staggered, gripping his Sharps rifle, but never managed to pull the trigger. A brief, choked cry rang out across the empty plains, then silence. When word of Sewell's death reached the hunters' camp, fury spread like wildfire. Defense was no longer on their minds. They gathered their rifles, tightened their saddles. Black Horse had sown terror now. It was time to hunt him down. Hunting the Comanche warriors, a group of about 45 hunters, armed with Sharps rifles, gathered under the command of Hank Campbell, with seasoned gunslingers like Limpy Jim Smith and Joe Freed among them. They weren't soldiers, but each man was a hardened veteran of the plains. "We'll finish this near the Tule River," Hank declared. The clash between the hunters and the Comanche warriors in that region would go down as one of the final battles between Native Americans and the frontiersmen of the West. Discovering the Comanche camp at Pocket Canyon, on March 18, 1877, the Texas Panhandle lay dry and barren in the grip of winter, but the seasoned hunters pressed on, tracking every hoofprint in the dirt, every drag mark through the brittle grass, and the remnants of old campfires. Scattered reports from other hunting parties helped them piece together Black Horse's movements. With each passing day, they drew closer to their prey. At last, as they entered Pocket Canyon, the signs became undeniable trampled grass from grazing horses, the charred remains of a fire, even lingering warmth in the crisp morning air. From a high ridge, Hank Campbell raised his binoculars. In the distance, nestled among jagged rocks and sparse trees, thin wisps of smoke curled into the sky. It was the Comanche camp. After days of relentless pursuit, Black Horse's trail had led them to what would soon become a battleground Pocket Canyon. In the dim light of dawn, they observed the buffalo hide lodges clustered together, the horses tethered near the creek, and Comanche women moving about, preparing for the day ahead. Without hesitation, the hunters spread out, planning a three-pronged assault. The orders were clear: women and children were not to be harmed. But for the hardened warriors of the Comanche, there would be no mercy. The Battle of Pocket Canyon ignites gun smoke curled into the air, blending with the thick dust rising from the narrow valley as the first shot shattered the morning silence, signaling the storm of war. The three divisions of hunters tightened their grip around the Comanche encampment, rifles poised. But before they could fire again, the Comanche warriors burst forth like a tempest. From within their buffalo hide lodges, they surged out, weapons gleaming under the sun, their war cries echoing across the hills. A furious counterattack swept through the battlefield, a raging flood that crushed the first wave of the hunters' assault. Joe Jackson barely had time to lift his rifle before a searing pain tore through his left arm. He stumbled, blood dripping through his fingers, but gritted his teeth and pulled the trigger. The bullet struck a charging Comanche horseman square in the chest, knocking him from his saddle. Screams, gunfire, and the thunder of hooves pounded the earth, a chaotic, brutal symphony of war. As the sun climbed higher, the battle's fury did not abate. Instead, a new wave of destruction swept through the land. The Comanche, aided by their Plains Apache allies, unleashed an ancient strategy fire. Flames roared across the dry grassland, devouring everything in their path. Smoke and ash swirled into the sky, blinding the hunters, choking them as they gasped for air. Horses reared and whinnied in terror, their instincts driving them to flee the encroaching inferno. Jackson wiped sweat and blood from his brow, his breath ragged. He scanned the battlefield. His comrades were being forced into a death trap. But even with death closing in, not a single man lowered his weapon. Then, amid the chaos, a young Comanche warrior broke from the ranks, charging straight into the heart of the hunters' formation. His eyes blazed with fury, his silhouette towering on horseback like an avenging god. He let out a ferocious cry, raising his spear high, heedless of the gun barrels pointed directly at him. A volley of shots rang out. The warrior jerked, his body freezing for a brief moment before he crumpled, tumbling from his horse like a withered leaf caught in the wind. For a second, the battlefield fell silent. The Comanche warriors stood motionless, disbelief etched onto their faces. They had fought for generations, endured endless wars, but now their last hope had fallen. And with him, the indomitable spirit of the Comanche wavered for the first time. The final stand of the last warriors. The Battle of Pocket Canyon marked the end of the Buffalo War of 1877. More than just a lost battle, it was a turning point, a historic moment that signaled the complete collapse of Comanche military power. From that day forward, the once mighty nomadic horsemen who had ruled the Great Plains would never rise again. The grasslands still turn green with each passing spring, but no longer do Comanche warhorses thunder across the prairie. Their legendary figures, once feared and revered, have now faded into the shadows of history.